October 1945, the war had ended, and with it, Adolf Hitler's dark reign was over. But what happened to the family behind the name? The bloodline that carried the legacy of one of history's most infamous men. While the world moved on from the wreckage of the Third Reich, the people who shared his blood were left to quietly fade into obscurity. In the aftermath of Hitler's death, his family's fate was sealed, not by force or consequence, but by an overwhelming shame. From Adolf's youngest sister Paula, to his nephews and nieces scattered across Europe, the bloodline he so fiercely championed was quietly extinguished, one choice at a time. These were the people who had to live with the consequences of his actions, trapped in a name that became a curse for future generations. This documentary seeks to uncover the untold story of the Hitler family after World War II. What happened to the people who shared his blood, and how did they live with the weight of their infamous relative? A name destined for annihilation. But what became of those who remained? The fall of Berlin, in May 1945, signaled the end of Adolf Hitler's reign. With his death, the Nazi empire he sought to create crumbled in an instant, leaving a power vacuum filled by the Allies. But the world's focus quickly shifted to the dramatic consequences of his actions, and the bloodline he left behind became a hidden, painful legacy. For Paula Hitler, the youngest of Adolf's full siblings, the post-war years were an unspoken struggle. A woman born into the shadow of a tyrant, she lived in isolation, with little to no connection to the world her brother once controlled. While Paula's older half-sister, Angela, moved in and out of Hitler's life, managing his household during his rise to power, she too faced the repercussions of their shared bloodline. Angela's relationship with Adolf became strained, especially after she married a man who, unlike Adolf, valued personal happiness over the ideology of Nazi rule. With the war's end, the family's future was marked by rejection, distance, and secrecy. Angela and Paula were left to hide their identity. Each member of Hitler's family navigated a complex path between survival and self-erasure, with some cutting ties with their infamous relative completely. The question remained, could one escape the legacy of Hitler, or was it an inescapable curse? By the late 1942, as the war came to a close and the world rebuilt, the family that had been part of Nazi Germany's inner circle found themselves on the fringes of history, silently fading into the shadows. What happened to the rest of the bloodline? In the years following World War II, the Hitler family became nearly invisible, buried beneath the weight of history. Yet, their fate remained bound to the legacy of a name that no one could escape, no matter how hard they tried. The name Hitler was synonymous with death, destruction, and the most monstrous ideology ever conceived. For Paula, Angela, and the remaining family members, the burden was unbearable. They were left to grapple with their connection to the man who had plunged the world into chaos. Paula, the last to bear the Hitler name, lived her life in hiding. After the war, she retreated to a quiet life in Austria under the alias Paula Wolf, a quiet attempt to escape the haunting memories. Yet, her isolation didn't protect her from the shadow of her brother's crimes. When she was detained by U.S. forces in 1945, she endured a harsh interrogation, forced to deny everything she knew about the atrocities committed by her sibling. Despite her denials, Paula could never escape the suspicion surrounding her. While many of Hitler's inner circle faced trials, the remaining family members were left to fend for themselves in a world that refused to forget the crimes of the Third Reich. Paula was left to live alone, her days marked by loneliness and rejection, as she tried to make a life for herself in the aftermath of unspeakable loss. Her final moments came quietly. On the 1st of June 1960, Paula died alone, her death unmarked by any ceremony. She had no children, no legacy beyond her name, and the world would never know her true story. Paula's tragic fate seemed to mirror that of many others in the Hitler bloodline, not annihilated by war, but by their own decision to vanish from history. As the Hitler family faded into silence, their stories did not die with them, they lived on in the hidden corners of history. The aftermath of the war was brutal for the remaining relatives, who struggled with the psychological toll of their last name. Alois Jr., William Patrick, and others sought to rebuild lives far removed from the horrors their last name symbolized, but the stain of their bloodline was never far behind. William Patrick Hitler, born in 1911, was perhaps the most defiant of all Hitler's relatives. In his youth, he sought fame by trying to align himself with the Nazi regime. However, when he realized that his infamous uncle was neither the man he imagined nor the ally he needed, he severed ties and publicly denounced Adolf. His 1939 interview with Look magazine titled "Why I Hate My Uncle" shook the world and solidified his departure from the Nazi cause. After fleeing to the United States, William Patrick changed his name and enlisted in the U.S. Navy during World War II, fighting against the very regime his uncle had created. It was a remarkable act of defiance. Yet, despite his attempt to leave the past behind, the weight of the Hitler name never fully left him. He, like the rest of the family, would choose a life of isolation. His 4 sons, born in the United States, would grow up unaware of the full extent of their father's history. For the next generation, life was quiet. William Patrick's sons, including Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian, chose anonymity. Despite their freedom, they made a quiet pact to let the Hitler legacy die. Howard, the only one to marry, passed away in a car accident in 1989, ending the line of Hitler descendants in the U.S. The surviving sons never married, and the bloodline quietly extinguished. The legacy of Adolf Hitler, born out of ambition, fear, and hatred, died with them. As the dust settled on the ruins of the Third Reich, the Hitler bloodline that had once inspired fear and commanded power silently came to its end. The legacy left by Adolf Hitler's family is a tragic reminder of how deeply the effects of war can echo through generations. The silent erasure of his family from history reflects not only the desire to distance themselves from his crimes, but also the heavy burden of shame that came with their name. For many of Hitler's remaining relatives, including Angela Rahl and her children, life after the war was a quiet retreat into obscurity. Angela, Adolf's half-sister, died in 1,949 inches relative isolation. Her children, including Leo Jr., had varying fates, but none of them managed to escape the shadow cast by their infamous relative. Leo Jr. served on the Eastern Front and was captured by Soviet forces. He spent years as a POW before quietly resuming life in Austria, leaving behind no legacy of his own. Heiner Hagler, Elfriede Rahl's son, also never married, continuing the quiet erasure of the Hitler bloodline. It was the unspoken pact of shame, of survival without reproduction, that marked the end of this once illustrious lineage. These choices, whether made in defiance or self-preservation, ensured that the Hitler family would not pass on their name or its curse. The legacy was extinguished without fanfare, with survivors opting for silence, living as ordinary citizens with no attachment to their infamous past. In the United States, William Patrick Hitler's descendants, the last known bearers of the surname, kept their lives free from the public eye. His sons, raising families far removed from the legacy of their grandfather, chose to live quietly, their stories never to be written in history books. The Stuart Houston line continued the trend of no children, no continuation of the Hitler name. In 2005, the remains of Paula Hitler, the last direct relative with the Hitler surname, were exhumed and quietly reburied. Under an unmarked grave, a final act of obscurity for the last living connection to Adolf Hitler. The bloodline that once aimed to dominate the world was now buried in anonymity. The end of the Hitler line stands as a powerful metaphor for the fall of the Nazi regime. The name that had once struck terror across the globe was abandoned, forsaken by those who had shared it, willing to let it die out. No heir, no future. The family name that had once held unimaginable power was no longer carried forward. Instead, the descendants sought normalcy, peace, and most importantly, to live outside the shadow of one of the darkest figures in human history. The story of Hitler's family is a cautionary tale of how the legacy of one man's actions can ripple through history, yet ultimately fade into nothing as his name and bloodline are quietly erased. The final act of silence echoes through generations, where the very heirs of a tyrant chose to remain silent, choosing to end their connection to a past that could never be undone. In the end, the family name of Hitler no longer exists in the world. It has been erased, not by war, but by the conscious choices of those who lived in its wake, who sought to live as ordinary individuals, far from the nightmare that their ancestor unleashed. The name that had once commanded the world's attention in fire and fury now lies in the forgotten corners of history.